Hi, this is Rick Rogers. This is my second video in which I discuss my scenario for the 2020 presidential election. Some things have changed. This video is actually put up on my Statistics Penguin channel. This is a change from the first video. I have taken out some of the partisanship, which is why I put the first video somewhere else. And I'm just looking at the model itself and what it says. I'm doing that because I actually do discuss election polling as an example in my class when I'm teaching research methods. So part of this is to document that. So some of you might actually be looking at this because it's an assignment at some point. So here we go. In this video, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to talk about the current scenario that I have. So if that's all you're interested in, there are two more slides and then you're done if you want to see my numbers. I do have with my model some assumptions that are pro-Trump, and I want to show you why those assumptions are there. When I say pro-Trump, that's not a partisan comment, that's a methodological comment. I do think when we look at how what we're seeing in the polls now, we do have to give Trump a handicap and give him more credit than we're actually seeing in the polls. So I'll go through that at the end. So if you're not interested in that, you don't have to stay. But some of you are going to be told, yeah, you have to stay and then come back to class and talk about this. Here's a brief summary of my model assumptions. I take a poll of polls approach, which assumes that the average of the polls is more accurate than any individual poll. There are two considerations in doing this. First, the dynamics of the central limit theorem, which says as we have more people and as we do more samples, we have a more accurate result. The second consideration is that some polls are sponsored for partisan purposes. So we want polls from one side. If we use polls from one side, we have to use the polls from the other side, and they cancel each other out. So that's why we use poll to poll. So all of my numbers are averages from that. In the battleground states, I also look at those polls. Now, when we say battleground states, what I mean is we only have to look at those states that look like they're contested. We don't see a lot of polling coming out of California because we all know that California is going to vote for Biden. We don't see a lot of polling that comes out of Kansas. We all know that Kansas is going to vote for Trump. So the battleground states are the ones that are really going to decide the outcome of the election. And that's where most of the state polling is done. So I look at polls taken over the last 14 days, and they're weighted by the recency of the poll. So the more recent polls count more than the ones that happened 12, 13 days ago. And I also factor in quality rankings of the polls based on the rankings that have been determined by Nate Silver on the 538 website. In a future year, when we do this 4 years from now, I might have my own quality rankings, but I have to put together that history first. I do make some adjustments that I think are true to what's happening. So Trump basically gets a 5% handicap. He gets 3% added to his total to account for polling error. He gets another 2% benefit because I take some percent away from Biden to deal with various issues about how the election is conducted. Also, if there are uncommitted voters and they exceed 5%, I give that distance over to Trump. Finally, I award to Trump any state where Trump is ahead in the polling. So none of my toss-up states are states where Trump is leading. And that's because of what happened historically. Most of the time in 2016, if the poll said that Trump was winning a state, he probably won that state. The problems came in the states that were predicted for Hillary. So that's why our handicapping favors Trump to deal with that issue. Here's the scenario. I have laid side by side where the model was pointing us 2 weeks ago on September 24th to where we are today. In the popular vote, the two important changes have occurred with Joe Biden His lead has gone from 7% to 9.6%. Also, he has crossed the 50% threshold, meaning that the majority of likely voters in the United States now plan to vote for Joe Biden, or because we've started voting, some of them already have voted for Biden. There has been a slight decrease in the percent uncommitted, and we will deal with that in a little bit later. That is important. Obviously, the most important thing is the Electoral College. I did change the Biden number from 2 weeks ago. So I had the 2 electoral votes for the 2nd congressional district in Maine going to Biden because of the polling. That was a tough call because there's not a lot of polling coming out of that area of Maine. And also, most people thought that that wasn't going to happen, that the polls were just not right. So I have retrospectively taken those 2 votes and moved them over to Trump. However, even with that, you'll see that with the surge towards Biden, it's also affecting the Electoral College. So I now have Biden at 332 electoral votes. Here I show the Electoral College and I assign each state to a category. So I do see Biden having 193 electoral votes from states where he already has a majority of the likely voters. New Hampshire has joined this group. New Hampshire had been a toss-up state leaning Trump, but in this surge that has occurred, New Hampshire is clearly a swung in Biden's direction. A lot of changes in the upper Midwest. Now, Minnesota and Wisconsin have moved down towards to being toss-up states. That has more to do with uncommitted voters, at least in the case of Minnesota. And by that, what I mean is it's not that Biden is losing a lot of votes. It's that uncommitted voters in those places are moving towards Trump, so they end up getting classified differently. However, in Pennsylvania, Biden is actually gaining ground, and although Biden does not have the majority of likely voters in Pennsylvania, he still has a lead, even with all of my pro-Trump assumptions. On the far right, we see Trump states. So there we have 145 electoral votes that are assigned to Trump. Georgia and Iowa have moved out of that category. So they are now moved as toss-up states where Trump is leaning. In addition, toss-up states where Biden is leaning, Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina now, according to my model, go into this category. Now the toss-up ones are the fuzzy ones. So by definition, if Trump is leading, even by a sliver, it goes to a Trump state because of the errors. So this is really where the model assumptions become important. So to be a toss-up state, I am saying that if all of the assumptions of my model are applied, that state is actually going to go Trump. So that column that says Biden leaning means that there is the possibility that I could see that state swinging towards Trump. But similarly, you have to keep in mind that the way I have defined the Trump states is that if you are a toss-up Trump leaning state, that means according to the poll of polls averages, Biden is actually leading there today. And so that's why we get these huge variations in discussions over what's going to happen. People say, well, Trump really could win. Yeah, he could if we apply all these assumptions. On the other hand, that 61 electoral votes that are leaning towards Trump, those could all go Biden because he is leading that way. So where I split this group is I go back to the traditional 3%. We don't think all of these states are going to go one way or the other. So I go back to the traditional 3% margin of error. So I say those where Biden is leading by more than 3%. Those are more likely going to go Biden, and the other ones are more likely with all of the things going on in the election. It's more likely that they're going to go Trump. So that's how that breaks out. We're going to talk about these states a bit as we go into the assumptions and break it out more. There is a lot to unpack here. This is the part of the video where I'm going to talk about some of the assumptions behind the model, and I'm going to specifically defend why some of these assumptions are going to favor Trump and should favor Trump. If you're watching the video just because you wanted to know what I was projecting, you have seen it. Feel free to go. If you want to know more about why I do those pro-Trump assumptions, or if you want to know, or if you're in one of my classes and I say you really have to look at this video because I'm going to work through all of this in greater detail in class, so this gives you some background, then you should be staying on and watching to the end. What I have here on this slide are what happened in 2016. So the first column comes from the Real Clear Politics website, where they have their own poll of polls. So I use that as a historic benchmark. And so that's what they predicted the election outcome to be. And then the next column is what actually happened. And the third column is the difference. If there's a plus sign, that means the outcome favored Trump. If it's a minus sign, that means the outcome favored Hillary Clinton. So one of the things that you see is the national polling came out really close. And the central limit theorem really does apply there. So as we do more sampling, we see more people, and also more samples lets us know that our individual sample is not an odd one. However, sampling on the state level is not as good, and there you see wide variations. So we do see in Arizona and Florida that Trump was predicted to win, and the margins were pretty close for polling. But we also see huge errors in Nevada and North Carolina. And notice the one in Nevada, that's actually a rare instance from 2016, where we see the prediction being that Trump would win the state, but when the votes actually came in, Hillary won the state. That was a 3% error, and we also see close to a 3% error in North Carolina. When we get into the upper Midwest, things are even worse. Michigan, the error was 3.7% and it favored Trump. Minnesota, the error was 3.7% in favor of Trump. Pennsylvania, 2.6% in favor of Trump. And Wisconsin was 7%. Not only was it 7% in Wisconsin, but that flipped the state. And you also see that in Pennsylvania and Michigan. Those errors were big enough to flip the state. So they thought Hillary was going to win based on the polls, but Trump ended up winning. Now, the pollsters are saying they fixed this, that they did not properly weight individuals who did not have college educations in their pollings, and so they've adjusted for that in this election cycle. I don't think that that's going to be enough, and the reason is they're not picking up the religion effect. A colleague and I are working on conspiracy theories about the pandemic, and we are using some survey data, and we are seeing evidence of a distinct religious effect in which white evangelicals favor messages that are coming from Trump about the pandemic, and we cannot explain that looking at the standard set of socio-demographic variables. So it's not completely tied to things that people normally talk about, like this block of voters is less educated or this block of voters is more rural. It does appear that there is a unique religious effect, and pollsters are not capturing that. And you do have to keep in mind that evangelical Christians are a sizable voting bloc in the United States. So I don't think the polls are capturing that. So we do need a hedge. In this column, we have what Biden's current lead is based on my poll of polls averages. And over here, this is where it really gets kind of interesting, because we got to ask a question. Okay, so the polls might be wrong, but does it matter? So nationally, if we take the difference from 2016 and we adjust the current Biden number accordingly, so we say the same kind of error is going to happen in the same place this year as happened in 2016. That's how we get that right column. And you see that in terms of the popular vote and the national level, Biden still has a huge lead. It gets really interesting in some other places. Now, in most of these places, Biden keeps his lead in those states, even with that assumption. So this idea that the polls were wrong in 2016, and so the same thing's going to happen in 2020, that doesn't hold because Biden right now has bigger leads than Hillary had. But we do see some places that are of interest. Now, North Carolina, which I have as a toss-up state leaning Biden, when we do apply the polling error, that lead narrows dramatically and it's then down to 0.8%. Remember that number. We're going to come back to that. That is like a magic number. The other state that gets really interesting is Wisconsin. According to the poll averages, Biden has a 5.9% lead in Wisconsin. But if we factor in this error from 2016, that state actually flips over to Trump. How that error happens does in fact matter. The next point I want to look at is my 2%. So I take 2% off of Biden because of issues tied to the election. Now, some of these things are labeled voter suppression, and some of them are just election mismanagement or people not getting the rules settled before the voting actually began. So these are large numbers. We'll start with North Carolina. Last week, with over 250,000 ballots mailed in North Carolina, over 3% of them had some kind of error or irregularity that had them pulled out of the pile. Now, North Carolina does have a policy that allows election officials to contact you to say there's a problem with your ballot. However, that's not happening yet because it's still tied up in court. If you back out the numbers that they're reporting by party and what they expect in terms of mail-in balloting, the Democratic candidate, Joe Biden, is going to lose 0.8% of his vote because of this issue. Magic number, remember? On the previous slide, 0.8%, that was the number at North Carolina in terms of the polling error. So we have the possibility that the problem with the ballots in North Carolina could be large enough to affect the outcome of that state. Pennsylvania expects to reject about 1.7% of the mail-in ballots. Now that's based on a straight line projection from what's happened in the past with mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania. I think it's going to be larger, and the reason why I think it's going to be larger is that people who normally would not ask for a mail-in ballot are going to ask for it. So we're going to get a bunch of people out there who aren't accustomed to voting this way, and they're going to make a lot of mistakes. Finally, one that's not being talked about a lot is in Iowa, where with the ballot request forms, there were errors in 7% that are disqualifying those forms. Now, it doesn't mean the person can't vote. However, it does raise a problem that if the voter fills that out and sends it in and doesn't fill out the second one because they're confused, they say, oh, I did it already, means that that person's not going to vote. That's massive, and the thing about that is a large chunk of that is in Democratic strongholds in eastern Iowa. So I do think it's fair to have this hedge against Biden, where we do think that these things are going to work against Biden, and so I do think a 2% hedge is fair. Finally, let's look at the uncommitteds. If we apply my model today, Biden would still win the popular vote, even if all the uncommitteds go over to Trump. That's different from 2 weeks ago. There still is the possibility that Trump could run the table and win all or most of the toss-ups because of the uncommitted vote. So that's a big issue. Now, this is a point where my assumption may no longer be true. To show you this, I have here a trend graph from the Real Clear Politics website where they give their poll averages, and I have it going back 3 months. So we're going back into July. And notice that the Biden trend line stays fairly stable. He's going up and down in a fairly narrow range So it looks like he has more or less 49% of the vote consistently. Flips up and down, not much. The change over the late summer and early fall was Uncommitteds shifting towards Donald Trump. And this largely appears to be a response to violence in cities. Most notably, the coverage of Portland is where that began, but certainly Minneapolis and Kenosha come into play. So we see that movement towards Trump, and that's been slow but steady into the end of September. So Biden still had a lead, but Trump was eating away at it. And then this changes. On the far right, we see there is an inflection point where Biden suddenly leaps up and Trump goes down. That inflection point happens on September 29th, which is the day of the first debate. So it is pretty clear that people's reactions to that debate have set something in motion in the electorate. Now, what we don't know is this a short-term bubble? And what we mean by bubble is sometimes there's an event in a campaign, and so people based on emotion move towards one candidate and not another. Or is it a permanent change in the election? So if it's a bubble, in a week or two, we're going to see this number start to come down. If it's not a bubble, it's going to still be there in 2 weeks. Where does all this leave us? I think there's trouble in Trump country. 2 weeks ago, I said the key state in the election was Pennsylvania, and if Trump flipped Pennsylvania, he won the election. That is no longer true. On the far right, we have states that should be safely Trump, and that 2 weeks ago we would have said we're definitely in the Trump column. There were signs of some change happening then, but not enough. But the change has definitely occurred. And Trump now has to defend, not simply swing over places like Georgia and Iowa, but he has to defend Texas and Ohio, which are getting pretty close to Biden majorities, or not Biden majorities, are getting close to Biden taking the lead there. That's pretty significant that he has to go back and defend a place like Texas. Similarly, when we look at the Biden leaning column, the only state that really mattered with Pennsylvania, we are now at a point where if he won Pennsylvania and Florida, Biden would still win the election. Now, North Carolina is one that I said I wouldn't, where I said I would not be surprised if it flips back to Trump, if not in my projection in the actual result, because of all the craziness going on there. If he got those three, Pennsylvania, Florida, North Carolina, and Trump could also hold his other states, that would be enough. But now this is a much more difficult pathway than he had just 2 weeks ago, and he can't just count on concentrating on 3 states because of what's happening with his base. So that's it. Trump is in trouble. That's not a guarantee that we're going to have a Biden win, but certainly at this point in time there is momentum with the Biden campaign. So that's it for today. I will be back before Election Day if there's more significant change. If not, I will talk to you about that at about that time with my final projection. Have a good day, and thanks for watching.